Hello, good people. It's Professor Wachtel. We are making the transition from our discussion of Plato's theory of human nature to our discussion of Aristotle's theory of human nature. Sometimes I imagine things that might be a little strange. For example, I've recently found myself imagining myself as a student in Plato's classroom, sitting in the back of the room listening as Plato's student Aristotle asked him questions. I imagine the following. I imagine Aristotle had some interesting questions about Plato's theory of human nature. Aristotle, being a sharp guy, had 3 questions, one of which has 2 parts. Question 1. In the Republic, Plato's discussion of the soul pertains only to humans. Are humans the only beings with souls? I imagine Aristotle wondering. Question 2. Plato's discussion of the soul in the Republic is driven by a concern with justice. All the discussion in the Republic started with the question of the nature of justice. That is, Plato's discussion of human nature in the Republic is driven by moral concerns. Could it be, I imagine Aristotle wondering, that the focus on moral concerns distracts us from important elements of the nature of the soul? Could it be that having our discussion of the nature of the soul fall in context of a moral discussion pulls our attention away from important elements that a discussion of the nature of the soul should include? Question 3. Plato's discussion of the nature of the soul in the Republic depends heavily on an argument from analogy. Is an argument from analogy sufficient for such an important topic? And finally, a related question to question 3, so let's call it question 3a. Is there any part of Plato's analogy of the city and the soul at which the analogy breaks down? In this short transition, I don't have a whole lot to say about question 1, other than that we should be aware of it as an assumption. It's true that in the Republic, Plato does not talk about any soul other than the human soul. Aristotle, in contrast, we will see, wonders, when we use the word soul, what do we mean? And very quickly, we will notice that he says this: the soul is in some sense the principle of animal life. Aristotle is considering the ways in which we use the word soul. What do we mean when we talk soul talk? And from the outset, he proposes that we don't use soul talk only with reference to human beings. Even though at the outset of De Anima, he identifies the soul as the principle of animal life, we will quickly see in our discussion of De Anima, soul is even more fundamental to nature than Aristotle first proposes. Keep in mind this question while thinking about De Anima. What kinds of beings have souls? Question number 2. Likewise, with this question, I don't have a lot to say in context of the introduction, other than that we must bear in mind the question of whether it makes most sense to situate our discussion of soul within a moral discussion. Moral discussions are discussions about the goodness of people. Which idea is fundamental? The meaning of soul as such, or the meaning of the good soul? What should come first in our inquiry? An understanding of what soul is, or an understanding of what a good soul is? Later in Aristotle's works, that is beyond the scope of what we'll be discussing in this course, Aristotle argues for a certain conception of a good person that requires prior understanding of the powers of soul that define a person. So I gently propose that Aristotle's avoidance of moral issues in De Anima is not a bad idea at all. Aristotle is putting the focus on the question of the nature of soul, and eventually in his discussion, the nature of the human soul. Question number 3, the question of whether argument from analogy is the appropriate type of argument to use in order to establish the nature of soul. Arguments from analogy are very often not considered to be the strongest types of arguments. Arguments from analogy are indirect arguments. They depend upon our understanding of something that is well observed, well understood, and the finding of likenesses between that well understood thing and the thing that we understand less well and are trying to understand better. You'll recall that in Plato's argument from analogy in the Republic, the discussion of justice crashes on the rocks until Socrates introduces the idea of the ideal city with the thought that understanding of the ideal city will allow us to see justice writ large and then double back with the question in mind of whether what is true of the city is true of the soul. It is an indirect argument. Aristotle, I imagine, wondered, is it possible to address the question of the nature of the soul in a more direct, in a more head-on way? You will see in De Anima that this is what he does. He examines soul as such. He examines soul on its own terms without comparing it to anything else. Question 3a. This is the question of whether or not the analogy of the city and the soul that Plato offered breaks down at some point. An argument from analogy is said to break down when the relevant similarity upon which the claim of likeness depends is compromised. Is there any aspect of the analogy of the city and the soul at which point the relevant similarity, the likeness upon which the argument depends, is compromised? In some respects, the argument from analogy in the Republic is pretty good. The function of the rulers and the function of the soul's rational power are very much alike. Similarly, the function of the producers and the soul's desiring power also seem to be very much alike. It may, however, be the case that the likeness proposed between the auxiliaries and the spirited, the so-called spirited part of the soul has a bit of a breakdown. In my previous video on whether or not what is true of the city is true of the soul, I went to some length to make the best possible case for a likeness between the auxiliaries and the spirited part of the soul. The job of the auxiliaries is to enforce the laws made by the rulers. And in looking at the Republic, Socrates proposes that the job of the spirited part of the soul is to enforce rationality over desire. In the case of Leontius, the spirited part of the soul failed to enforce reason over desire. In the case of the hiker in the movie 127 Hours, I proposed that the spirited part succeeded in enforcing the rule of reason over desire. In both of those examples, the spirited part is conceived of as always on the side of reason. That is, the faculty of action, the faculty of soul by which the person takes action, is conceived as always on the side of reason. It may not be strong enough in all cases, but it is always on the side of reason. I wonder this as a possible thought about the breakdown of the analogy of the city and the soul. What if the faculty from which the person acts is not necessarily always on the side of reason? Could it be the case that a person could force himself or herself to act deliberately against reason? I certainly don't recommend trying this. It doesn't seem like any good for the person could come from this. The question is merely, could it happen? Could a person act this way? If a person could act this way, then I wonder whether or not the relationship between the rulers and auxiliaries on the one hand, and the relationship between the rational part of the soul and the spirited part of the soul on the other hand, are the same. If it turns out that they are not the same, then the function of the spirited part of the soul, the function upon which the analogy depends, is questionable. As a final thought, and this pulls us back to both questions 2 and 3, could it be that Plato's concern with morality and his building of the analogy of the city and the soul, so to address questions not only of the parts of the soul, after all that's never his primary purpose, but of the goodness of the soul, compels Plato to view the parts of the soul as concerns morality? Even if he's correct that the faculties of soul that he proposes exist, is he being exhaustive? Is he getting at all the parts of the soul just by being concerned with the goodness of the soul? Could it be that there are some parts of the soul that are essential but not directly concerned with the moral goodness of the living being, or with the person as Plato conceives? So I imagine Aristotle as having a few questions as he sat in Plato's class. As a result of having questions like the ones that I have just proposed, Aristotle addressed the nature of soul by a very different method than that used by his teacher. Aristotle's approach to understanding the nature of the soul is commonly thought to be more scientific, specifically more biological. In following discussions, we will examine his approach in detail.